Okay, next week's presentation. Don't Learn Spanish, Do This Instead, by Phil Rylett.
Who's that?
So, okay. So Phil Rylett, okay, I'll talk about myself in the third person here. Do you want to learn Spanish, or do you want to speak and understand it? We have been told that this path to speak and understand a second language is by learning it. But what if this is not the case? Have we been led down the wrong path? What can we learn from the latest studies that will help you communicate in Spanish? Phil will relate the latest studies that shed doubt on learning Spanish and in its place the alternative of acquiring Spanish. So Phil Rylett spent years studying Spanish before coming to Mexico. Classes, books, courses, schools, etc. And I was extremely disappointed when I arrived in Ajijic and I couldn't understand a bloody word. I could hardly understand the local conversations. And some of my Mexican friends, however, spoke reasonable English. And they never had any formal instruction. So I went on a, because of the disappointment of my own sort of progress in Spanish, I embarked on an investigation on what is the best way to get communicative competency. I shouldn't have used that word. So that will be revealed next week, but only if you come. No, the video will be available later. Shouldn't say that. All right. Anyway, this week's presentation. Oh, there he is. Good. Thank God he set his clock forward, eh? It is only by leaving your home that you find it. Presented by David Ellison. You may have been here for David's excellent talk on Mexican history a few weeks ago. Well, this is the second part of covering the Mexican War for Independence. We'll get to know the stories behind the familiar street names as he takes us on a walk through Mexico's history and more. David Ellison recently retired after 36 years in education. He was a teacher. History was his favorite subject. Mentor teacher, school administrator, education columnist, community activist, lead guitarist for ZZ Top. The list goes on. He was honored as the New Haven Unified and the American Council of School Administrators Region 6 Teacher of the Year in 1996. Please give a warm and safely distant welcome to David Ellison. Oh, do you want me to put it? Yeah.
I'm sorry. That would be great, yes. Good morning. Am I on yet?
No, is your button on?
Oh, is my button on? Good morning, and thank you for coming. I love to tell stories, and I love to talk about history, so this is, for me, a real pleasure. And this one, I just thought, you can never, some people say you can never come home again. The idea being that once you leave, you change, and you aren't the same person, and home isn't the same. I'm thinking you have to leave your home to find it. And I left my home many years ago to go to Spain, which is where I learned to speak Spanish. But it's also where I learned really about my own country from a foreign perspective, which was invaluable. But what's been funny for me, I'm writing a book on Mexican history. It's called Niños Héroes, The Fascinating Stories Behind Mexican Street Names. And I've taught U.S. history for years and years, but it's by studying Mexican history that I really began to study my own. And some things that I had taken for granted, once I looked at Mexico, I went, oh my God, I had no idea how important this was in my own nation's history. So today we're going to focus, and I'm taking you backwards. I sort of studied U.S. history first and then began to appreciate it. We're going to sort of go backwards, and we're going to look at American history, and that's going to help us appreciate Mexican history. And we're going to focus today on the Mexican War for Independence, not to be confused with the Mexican Revolution, which was the uprising against Porfirio Diaz. Maybe I'll come back and do that another day. Before we go there, though, it's something I taught my students to understand democracy. What are the generally accepted prerequisites if you're going to build a democratic country? And the list is long, but most seem to agree on this 6. First of all, you have to have experience with self-rule, with democracy, before you actually inaugurate a constitution and such. Many people consider capitalism to be important, that it doesn't work very well under communism, but capitalism can lead toward democracy. And along with that, a strong middle class. So democracy doesn't work well when you've got a huge chasm between the wealthy and the poor. You need a common culture and language, and you need respect for differences, and respect for the rule of law, and finally a high level of education. And you can probably manage if you're missing one or two of those, but if you don't have any of them, the chances of democracy succeeding are generally considered to be pretty difficult. Now, I mention this because this leads to a quick discussion of American exceptionalism. And I don't mean the American exceptionalism of today. I have to say the ways in which my country are exceptional today are in general pretty deplorable. I mean, we've got one of the highest rates of income inequality, highest rates of childhood poverty, childhood diabetes, childhood depression. I think we're rated 37th in by the United Nations in terms of childhood well-being. We have the highest rate of incarceration on the planet. We're, I think, the only industrialized nation today that will not give all its citizens health care. Highest rate of military spending, and so on. So the ways in which we're exceptional today are not any way in which I'm proud of. But we were truly exceptional at our founding. We were sitting pretty. We were uniquely fertile ground to be the first country, at least in modern times, to take the ideas of the Enlightenment and to stop talking about them and actually do it. And I just want to talk about a few of them because that's going to help us understand Mexico. Spoiler alert, Mexico didn't enjoy any of these, and that had dire implications for what followed. So first of all, let's go back to the beginning of the United States. We'll look at the Pilgrims, who were blown way off course, way far away from the land where they had their charter from England. So they had no charter. And so before they even got off the boat, they made the Mayflower Compact their own government. From the very beginning, we were making our own decisions here. And all through the years, Britain practiced something with us called salutary neglect, which means beneficial neglect. They said, the money's rolling in, so you just keep doing what you're doing. You can make your own decisions. We don't care. And it was only after the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, where England was bankrupt, that they changed that, and that was what started the revolution. And we said, no, we're going to continue to make our own decisions. Another thing, we did have capitalism, but one thing we did that Mexico did not, as you know, and I'm not saying one is more moral than the other, I'm just saying that we pushed the natives out of the way, just got them out. Just kept pushing them out, but we never incorporated Native Americans into our economy. And that is, in retrospect, a boon for our capitalistic economy, because we never ended up with this vast underclass or exploited class that much of Latin America did. And that is going to prove to be really disastrous for their economy. An example would be, for example, in Central America, there's really only one really thriving economy where there's a very strong middle class, and that's Costa Rica, which never really had a Native American population. The Spaniards who got there just said, we're going to have to do the work ourselves, and that proved to be a boon for Costa Rica, which, by the way, I forgot to say this, a book a friend of mine named Ellison recommended it. She said, if you're going to write a book on Mexican history, there's a book you have to read first, and it's called Many Mexicos, which I couldn't find anywhere but our library here. So I checked it out, and it's now hopelessly overdue. Thank God for COVID, there are no fines now. But one of his quotes that I'm going to put at the beginning of my book goes like this: how shall we measure the weight of time? How make clear the deep mark of its pressure on the habits of mankind? The weight of history, the weight of time, what came before leaves its mark indelibly on what follows. And I guess that's the theme of everything I'm going to say. I'm going back to look at, you know, the early time, and then we're going to see the weight of it as it was carried forward. So we just pushed the natives out, and for our economy and for our democracy, that will prove to be in our advantages, to our advantage. And then the American farmer was a unique breed at the time. Remember, many people left Europe because there just wasn't land, and most of the land was in the hands of a small oligarchy. So they came here and they owned their own land, which meant they were making their own decisions on their property, and that carried over to everything what they expected. And I'm gonna, just an anecdote, I love this anecdote, so I'm gonna digress and come back, but I think you'll be glad I went there, about a gentleman by the name of Baron von Steuben. Anybody ever hear of him? Most people have not, and there's a reason for that. I'll tell you that in a minute. But he was a Prussian military officer and one of the world's best military trainers. And he was recruited by Benjamin Franklin to come over and train our troops at Valley Forge, because George Washington had gotten his butt kicked at the Battle of Long Island and spent the next year or so running away from the British. It became very clear that our Minutemen, just if they stood up against the British regulars, they were going to get just cut to pieces. And so Franklin brought over this trainer, and he trained the troops in Valley Forge. And the testimony to how well he trained them, after Valley Forge, the still bedraggled ragtag army marched out of Valley Forge, and they came to the crossroad, and they expected to turn left and continue their flight away from the British. And George Washington turned right and headed back towards them, and there was a cheer. They were tired of running. And at the Battle of Monmouth, the British came out and they said, finally, we are going to obliterate them. And they fought to a standstill. They couldn't defeat the Americans. We were now a professional, well-trained army, and the British were stunned, and they retreated back into New York and never came out again. The tables were completely turned. Thank you, Baron von Steuben. And at the end of the war, the Congress granted him a lifetime pension, and most historians call him, after George Washington, the second most indispensable man in the American Revolution, which then begs the question, why haven't you heard of this man? And it's very easy. He was gay, and which is why he couldn't find a job in Europe. But beggars couldn't be choosers. Franklin didn't care. He said, if you can train troops, just get over here, we'll use you. And anyway, all of this led up to this anecdote. Baron von Steuben said this about these American troops. Initially, he was very frustrated with them, and then the troops endeared themselves to him, and he ended up really respecting them. And he wrote, he said, you know, when I trained troops in Prussia, I would say, do this, and they'd go, jawohl, and they just did it without question, of course. I get to these farmers and I say, do this, and they go, why? I had to explain why. And once they understood why, then they did it. And he said, that's the difference in these Americans. I mean, we were a different breed of people. We owned our own land, we made our own decisions, and damn it, you better tell me why, because I need to understand. We were generally pretty damn educated as well. Next, we had a very clear goal in our revolution. Thank you very much, Thomas Jefferson. We knew from the outset that we weren't just going to have a revolution against King George and then install our own King George Washington. We said, we're going to get our independence and we're going to establish a republic. And so we agreed on that. There was unanimity in what we were doing and what we were hoping to accomplish. We also agreed from the outset in a separation of church and state. And these are hugely important in our later history. The two things that we really didn't agree on, we agreed to postpone, and you probably know those, the first being slavery, and the second being the argument between Federalists and Republicans. Just how strong a central government were we going to have? And this These arguments were ongoing. They didn't go away. But the difference was, for the first 110 years of our country's history, we didn't kill each other over these arguments. We had 110 years of domestic peace to build a nation. 110 years to take our wealth and throw it into infrastructure. I mean, I never appreciated that until I studied Mexican history. And then I went, oh my goodness, were we fortunate. All right, and then of course, finally, we couldn't postpone these arguments anymore, and both of them came to a head in the American Civil War. And lately, there's been revisionist history to say that, you know, the war was only about slavery, and that's, I mean, it's just ridiculous. That just shows a real ignorance of all the history that came before it. But there's a famous line that says, before the American Revolution, we said the United States of America are a good nation. And after the Civil War, we said the United States of America is a good nation. And so it was the triumph of the central government. And another anecdote about that would be, unfortunately, it just kills me, the Robert E. Lee, who was very clear that he called slavery a moral and political evil. So he certainly wasn't going to fight to preserve slavery. And Abraham Lincoln offered him the command of all federal forces, and he said, I'm sorry, wherever Virginia goes, there must I go. I must go and defend Virginia from the federal government. And so you can see what was on the table, what was being fought over wasn't just slavery. But we had 110 years of peace before we got there. Mexico will have none of that, with really, really dire implications. And lastly, we had just amazing leaders. We were really gifted. So many people say that people who designed our Declaration and our Constitution may have been the finest assembly of men in the history of the planet. And then I'll tell you an anecdote just about George Washington. And this one isn't known, but it may be one of his greatest moments. In the war, the Second Continental Congress was anything but efficient, and they hadn't succeeded in getting money to the troops, much less the officers. And the officers had it. And they said, that's it, we're sick of the Congress. We are going to march on Philadelphia. We are going to disband the Second Continental Congress. The Army is going to take over, and we'll get our pay. But they knew Washington wouldn't agree, so there was a cabal of officers who were planning this. And Washington caught wind. And so they had a meeting, and who shows up but Washington, and they are pissed. And they're glaring at him. We said, we aren't going to listen to you. Our mind is made up. And Washington, begged them. He pleaded with them. And at one point, he reached into his jacket, and he pulled out a letter from the Congress, promising to pay. But he was going to read it to them, and he fumbled about and took out a pair of spectacles, which were pretty brand new at the time, and put them on his head to read, and his officers were stunned. They had never seen him do this before. And he said, oh, I'm sorry, didn't you know? Among everything else I've given up from my country, I've lost my eyesight as well. And then there was this long moment of silence, and then the officers just broke down, and some of them were sobbing. They came over, they hugged him, and they said, okay, 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 we won't march on Philadelphia. Washington stopped that. Washington understood, the weight of time, the power of precedent. More than any other man alive, he said, everything we do will set the tone, the habits of what will come. Now, of course, France went the way of military dictatorship and Robespierre, and what a nightmare it was. The man who saved us from that was George Washington. And then after he was president, we had no term limits, he could have stayed president forever. And in a case of sort of modern-day Cincinnatus, he stepped down because he said, I need to set the example of a peaceful transition of power. All of this set us up for a successful democracy. Okay, now let's go look at Mexico. And because of what the United States had and took for granted, you're going to appreciate what Mexico lacked in a way that when I read it now, it helped me understand the United States, and then I looked back at Mexican history and I went, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. So let's look at just, first of all, Mexico had no experience with democracy, from Montezuma, who was the theocratic king, god, to the viceroys who came over from Spain and ruled, one-man rule. That was their experience, and this will set up the expectation of caudillos, or great national leaders like Santa Anna and Porfirio Diaz. All right, they're looking for a savior, or one man to call the shots. That's their experience. Number two, Spain did not have a strong middle class. On the contrary, in Mexico, it had a rigid racial and political caste system. At the top were the Spaniards who came over from Spain to rule. They became the viceroys, the governors, the mayors, the bishops. You had to be born in Spain in order to wield that kind of power. Beneath them were the Creoles. These were the Spaniards who were born here in Mexico. So sorry, you were not born in Spain. You can never rise to the positions of real power. Now imagine the level of frustration and resentment the Creoles felt. You know, your birth prevents you from getting above a class ceiling. Beneath them were the mestizos, which is the mixture of Spanish and Native American blood, and at the bottom were the Native Americans, and they were effectively slaves. And that's the big difference, one big difference. We just pushed the natives off. The Spaniards came here for quite a different reason. They came for gold, but part of that gold was just native labor. They came over with the intention of enslaving them and creating what this author, Leslie Bird Simpson, who wrote the Many Mexicos, he called it the parasitic class. The people who came over to be parasites of the Native Americans and used them as their slaves. And this created a perpetual, huge, feudal, underclass, AKA a feudal society. And feudal societies do not a strong economy make. It's a very, very poor, weak economy. And as an example, which states in the United States today remain among the most poor? It's the American Southeast, the former Confederacy, the former slave states. This is, once again, you can see the weight of history moving forward. There was a huge price to pay for them having established essentially a feudal society in the American South. And they're still living that legacy today. The past stays with us. And this is true for the United States. It stays with them there. They had created something called the encomienda system, which was feudalism. A Spanish conquistador would come over, he was granted a huge land grant, and he owned everything on that land, including the natives. And so they set up a whole parasitic class of oligarchs and a dramatic underclass of Native Americans, which, by the way, continues today, even in Mexico. And there's still tremendous racism and oppression of natives in Mexico today. And then, unfortunately, when they began, they didn't have Washingtons. They had people like Santa Anna and Guerrero who, right out the gate, didn't like the new government, and so they began the very first Civil War. Right out the gate, the minute they established a new government, 2 Mexicans rose up in revolution against their own government. And this will continue for the next 30 years. The first 30 years of Mexican history are endless civil war. And in the first 30 years, only one president actually completed his term. There were 50 different governments, and they estimate that somewhere about 300,000 Mexicans died in this endless series of civil war. Now compare that to our 110 years of peace in the United States. We took our wealth and threw it into infrastructure. They took their wealth and threw it into killing each other. It's horrific. So let's look at the situation of Spain at the time of their war for independence. Napoleon III had invaded Spain and overthrown the king. The king was now living in exile. So there was a puppet French dictator there. There was the king living in exile, and then throughout Spain, there were little governments that tried to step in. They were called juntas that stepped in to rule in the absence of the king, which then begs a question. Who's in charge of the colony of New Spain, aka Mexico? Is it the French puppet? Is it the deposed king? Is it these juntas? Who's running the show? Which created here in Mexico a huge power vacuum. Who was running? And at the time, where the viceroy was one of Creole leanings, and the conservatives and the Spaniards feared he might take this as an opportunity to start a movement for independence. So they overthrew him. And the irony is that's what convinced the Creoles to say, okay, that's it, we're going to have a revolution. So by trying to prevent it, they ended up sort of precipitating it. But that begs the question, okay, we're going to have a revolution. What's our goal? Is it to just eliminate these conservatives that have taken over here in Mexico and establish a better government? Is it to break away from the king of Spain and create our own king? Is it to have a king here, our own king? Or is it to create a government here that addresses this caste system and all the social and economic inequality? What are we fighting for? And the answer is pretty much all of the above, depending on whom and when you asked. You had a long list of revolutionaries that make up the street names here, people like Hidalgo, Guerrero, Guadalupe Victoria, Nicolas Bravo, Morelos, Marcos Castellanos. They didn't agree on what they were fighting about. Which you can already see, once we establish independence, we haven't even agreed on what we're fighting to achieve. The only thing they agreed on is Mexico will be a Catholic nation. That's the only thing everyone agreed on. And so from the very beginning, there wasn't going to be the separation of church and state that the United States has enjoyed. And the church will remain this huge part of this small oligarchy at the top with immense power and immense wealth. At one point, they estimate that the church owned over half the land in Mexico. Not a healthy way to make an economy. So anyways, the other thing, so let's start talking about some of these street names and these people. Before you can understand them, these people, Hidalgo, Morelos, Castellanos, Matamoros, they were all Catholic priests. It's a revolution led by Catholic priests. Now, I was raised a Catholic. What? What are priests doing getting involved in a revolution? And today we have a name for this, the belief that these priests believe that God is not just about heaven. God wants to establish the kingdom of God here on earth. We need to be fighting for justice and equality here and now. And later this would be given the name liberation theology in Central America when the Jesuit priests led uprising against the American-sponsored ruthless dictatorships. But they didn't have a name for it then. But these are priests that practiced it, sort of, proto-liberation theologians. So we'll get to them in a minute, but I have to begin with one of my favorite people, a woman. And a lot of these, they're painted up here on the wall as you walk away from the plaza here. There's a series of painting, and her name is Josefa Ortiz de Dominguez, better aka Josefa. Everyone say that, Josefa. She's fun. Have you ever heard the expression, well-behaved women rarely make history? She was not well-behaved, and she made history. She lived in Queretaro. Her husband was the mayor, and she had read a lot of the Enlightenment books, and she started a book club. That was it was called the Queretaro Conspiracy, aka the book club. Well, we'll read all the books we aren't supposed to read and begin to talk about revolution. And she ended up dragging her husband, the mayor, into this, and then eventually, guess where they hosted the meetings? In their home. But they weren't very secretive about it, and the viceroy caught wind of it, not really understanding what was going on out there, so he sent a message to the mayor saying, hey, there's some sort of revolution going on in your town. Get to the bottom of it. And so what do you do if you're the mayor and you're holding these meetings in your home? and you've just been told to get to the bottom of it. Well, he said, oh man, I am in so much trouble. I'm going to try to save my family. And so the first thing he did is he locked Josefa up, because he knew that she would not agree, locked her in a room upstairs, and then he went around and arrested a few token revolutionaries so he could say, I'm doing my job. We can imagine how Josefa felt about that. And from the upstairs room, she got word out. She was sort of the Paul Revere of Mexico. She said, the jig is up, get word out to Miguel Hidalgo and Allende. And so if Miguel Hidalgo is the father of the Mexican Revolution, Josefa is the mother. And when it was all said and done, and the first government was Iturbide, the king, he wanted to honor her and say, why don't you become one of my ladies in waiting, you know, be here on the court. And she said, I was fighting for a republic. And so she remained true the entire time. Oh, by the way, eventually the viceroy found out what was going on. He arrested the mayor, but the mayor was so popular he had to release him, or that would have started the revolution. But there was no such mercy for Josefa, because everybody knew she was the ringleader. They arrested her, her husband defended her, lost, and they sent her to prison, but they didn't have prison for women, so they sent her to a convent. She was so misbehaved, they sent her to a far stricter convent. She was so misbehaved, they finally sent her home under house arrest. I mean, Josefa, I would have liked to have met this woman, a misbehaved woman who made history. All right, the other guy, the guy who goes down as the father of Mexican independence. And for most of these, we have to talk about two people at once. And in this case, we have to talk about Miguel Hidalgo, Father Miguel Hidalgo, and Allende. Allende was a military officer, Miguel Hidalgo was a priest. And he's interesting. They called him Zorro, or the fox, in school. He was very bright. He fathered at least 8 children with 4 different wives. Priest. But that didn't get him into trouble. It was when he began to challenge the bishop about the treatment of Native Americans that he got into trouble. And so they banished him to a small village where there were lots of Native Americans. They pretty much said, go play with your Native Americans. And hasta nunca, see you never. And, but he got involved in the Queretaro Conspiracy with Josefa, and also with Allende. And their plan was for Allende and another officer to lead the revolution. Military officers would lead it. But, as you know, the word got out, and so they had to declare revolution early. So Josefa got word out, the rider came to Miguel Hidalgo, and he said, the jig is up, they're coming for us. And so he went, he said, ring the bells, let's start it now. But see, they hadn't finished preparing yet. They didn't know what they were going to do. And so in the end, because Miguel Hidalgo declared it, and he becomes the leader and not the military officers that they had originally planned, this as well will have some dire implications. He rang the bell on 16 de septiembre. That's when he rang the bells, and they now say that's the beginning of the War for Independence. And he said, and once again, he's beginning the revolution with these words, and I ask you, so what are they fighting for? He said, long live religion, long live our most holy mother Guadalupe. And they adopted Our Lady of Guadalupe as the sort of the banner, their flag of the War for Independence. And she's interesting because Our Lady of Guadalupe appeared to a native person, which the Creoles and the Spaniards were like, that can't be true. She would appear to us, not one of these natives. And ever since then, you know, the people of Mexico and people of color in particular have looked to Our Lady of Guadalupe. She cares about us. In any event, that was the banner of Miguel Hidalgo. So he says, long live religion, long live our most holy mother of Guadalupe, long live the Spanish king, long live America, and down with bad government. So who's the enemy? It's not really clear. But either he said or the people said in response, death to the Spaniards. And that became their rallying cry. These poor natives grabbed their pitchforks and their machetes, and they began to march from one hacienda to another, and it was not pretty. They murdered all the Spaniards wherever they went. They were sick of the encomienda system, they were sick of slavery, they were sick of injustice, and they were ruthless. In the end, he had about you can't really call it an army, it was a mob of about 90,000. And when they got to Pueblo, there was a granary there where the local government and both Spaniards and Creoles had taken refuge. And when Hidalgo's mob broke through, they murdered everyone, men, women, children. And so this was a really cruel and bloodthirsty revolution. Oh my goodness, 10 minutes left, and I've just started Miguel Hidalgo. I've done it again. Oh. In any event, this mob, that was the worst. And Allende, the military officer, was aghast. He said, what we need is a small, disciplined army, not a mob. And this mob, turned a lot of the Creole support of this war against them. They just said, we cannot support this. Anyways, Miguel Hidalgo thinks, I've got 90,000, I'm invincible. And for a while, he was. It was bloody, it was awful. They get to just outside Mexico City. And then he makes a decision that even today we scratch our head at. All they had to do was just unleash the 90,000 and Mexico City is his. He turned away. We don't know why. It could be he himself was finally, if I unleash these on Mexico City, the blood will be running through the streets. I can't allow that. Who knows? But he turned away, and that took a lot of the wind out of their sails. And it gave the Spaniards time to build their army. And then they met on an open field, 90,000 peasants versus a well-trained army. And it didn't go well for the insurgents. And towards the end, Allende just pushed Miguel Hidalgo aside and said, you are not leading this revolution anymore. But it was too little, too late. They were both caught, captured, put on trial, and killed. And they said, all right, that's the end of that revolution or that war for independence. And one thing that is suppressed is before he died, Hidalgo penned in his own writing just a impassioned letter of remorse, regretting everything he has done and had done. And so today the debate, was he forced to do that or not? But at least most of the historians tend to think, no, it seems to be pretty straightforward. Let me, since I've only got 10 minutes left, and once again, I'm not going to get through anything. Let me tell you about one of my favorite guys, and I'll end with him, Guadalupe Victoria. And his real name, which I'll never remember, I think I have it here. Here he is. His real name was Jose Miguel Ramon Aduacto Fernandez. So he had to change his name. I mean, it's just too long. He changed his name to Guadalupe Victoria. Guadalupe after Our Lady of Guadalupe, and Victoria saying he dedicated his life to winning this war for independence. And he fought under Morelos, who is, I think, most widely regarded as the best revolutionary at this time, also a priest. And so maybe next time I'll pick up with him. But I want to finish with just a neat story. This one really inspired me. He was an amazing fighter. He fought under Morelos. Where do you go here? He said, La independencia se afianzará con mi sangre y la libertad se perderá con mi vida. Independence will be reinforced with my blood, and freedom will be lost with my life. It was sort of the give me liberty or give me death. He pledged his life to winning this war, and he was extremely brave fighter. In the siege of Oaxaca, there was a moat and then a drawbridge. They couldn't get across the moat. He went up, took his sword off and threw it across the moat, and he said, there goes my blade, and I'm going after her. And he swam across the moat, picked up his blade, and was able to cut through the ropes, and the drawbridge came down, and the day was won. He was put in command of a very large force, and for a while, as with most of these revolutionaries, he enjoyed victory after victory after victory, but it wasn't to last. And in the end, he began to lose, as did Morelos and everyone. And after one particularly bad defeat, his army abandoned him. Just said, we're done with you. You're losing. Bye. And so it appeared as if the revolution was over. And the viceroy just wanted it to be over. He offered amnesty to all the revolutionaries. If you agree to put down your weapons and come back, no arrests, no murders, nothing. If you're Guadalupe Victoria, can you go back and accept this amnesty? Not with a name like that. Your troops have abandoned you. You can't take the amnesty. If the Spaniards get you, they will put you to death. What do you do? And so he ran off into the jungles, where he lived for 4 years, eating roots and berries and wild game. I mean, just off by himself. It was really bad. He ended up contracting epilepsy, which is what will eventually kill him. And imagine his despair. I mean, his troops have abandoned him. The cause seems lost. And I mean, what the heck are you going to do? And every once in a while, he would emerge into some far-flung mountain town, and word would spread, there's been a Guadalupe Victoria sighting. And unbeknownst to him, he became legendary. Now, at the war's end, he gets word, you can come out now. It's safe. And he expects to come out and say, oh, you, loser. And instead, he comes out and he discovers that he has become a national hero. Guess who becomes Mexico's first president? Guadalupe Victoria. Let's see, as a president, he established a merchant marine, which opened up international trade, a navy which succeeded in defeating the final Spanish outpost in Mexico, multiple seaports for them both. He expelled the rest of the Spaniards, put down several plots and rebellions, including one by his own vice president, Nicolas Bravo, abolished slavery, promoted education, and he became the only Mexican president during the country's first 30 years, to finish his term. A pretty amazing achievement for someone who thought he was a failure in the jungle. And I'll end on that story, even though I haven't even gotten through, but I just like that. I find him to be particularly inspiring.